Resistance against the Axis powers during the Second World War was widespread. Resistance in German-occupied Norway to resistance in Axis-controlled Yugoslavia. But what about German resistance against Hitler during the Second World War? Some stories you're familiar with. Think of the 1944 July plot. But there are also the lesser known factions and stories. For example, the Cologne Uprising, late 1944. In this video, I'm going to present you with an overview of the German resistance against the Nazis during World War II. Keep watching. Good to have you back on the channel. I'm Stefan, I'm a Dutch history teacher and I like to hustle history for you. And if you find it interesting, well, consider subscribing and also hit that notification bell. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the Nazis unleashed a purge against political enemies, socialists, communists, liberals and other people they deemed a threat for their totalitarian regime. Before World War II broke out, tens of thousands of opponents or alleged opponents were interned in concentration camps. During the war, this number would increase. See, within the group of the German opportunists and neutralists, there were people that started to doubt the Nazi regime when the effects of the war became visible in Germany. Think of shortages, or the Allied bombings, or the soldiers that were killed in action on the battlefield. Many doubted the book burnings, the indoctrination sessions, and deportation of the Jews by the Nazis. However, resistance in Germany was much harder than in the German occupied areas. In Germany, members of the NSDAP, the SA and the SS kept an eye on the people. A majority of the German people did support Hitler, which decreased the chance on resistance. And during the war, many Germans saw resistance against Hitler or the party as treason. Resistance did occur, and it came from different factions. Think of socialists, who were members of the SPD, or communists of the KPD, social democrats, liberals, also conservatives of the army and the church, and also students. These people took people into hiding who were wanted by the authorities. They aided Jews or they spread anti-Nazi leaflets. That's what members of the White Rose, such as Sophie Scholl, did. With their small acts of resistance, they had no chance to overthrow the Nazi regime. And as the war progressed, many of these resistance members were arrested, executed, or deported to concentration camps. Many were executed just before the war came to an end, such as Wilhelm Canaris and Hans Oster, leaders of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor. So let's take a look at the church. There were two prevalent religions in Germany when Hitler came to power: the Evangelical Lutheran Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the church leaders were afraid that their institutions would be abolished by the Nazis. And Hitler actually wanted to do this, but he was hesitant to do so. So therefore, he tried to make the churches an ally of the Nazi regime. And to be fair, some political points of the Nazi party overlaps with the views of the church, such as anti-communism and the traditional roles in the family. The German church did object when the Nazis undertook Action T4, a campaign of mass murder by involuntary euthanasia in psychiatric hospitals. In the summer of 1941, the murders were temporarily halted due to the protests of Bishop Clemens August von Galen. By that time, many psychiatric patients had been murdered, and many continued to do so in secret as the Nazis continued to carry out their killings. Over 250,000 patients would perish at the hands of the Nazis during the war. So let's take a look at the different German resistance factions that existed during the war. There was the White Rose, the Weiße Rose. It was a non-violent student group in Munich. Its most prominent member was Sophie Scholl. They spread anti-Nazi leaflets from the summer of 1942. Around half a year later, they were arrested, and many of the group, among which Sophie Scholl, were executed after a show trial. there was the Red Orchestra. This was a group within the German Abwehr, which had around 400 members that are known by name, such as Harro Schulze-Beusen, Adam Kuckhoff, and Arvid Harnack. Just as the members of the White Rose, they also spread anti-Hitler leaflets, but they also aided Jews and provided the Allies with information by committing espionage. It was a network of different groups and individuals, often operating independently. The Kaisaal Circle was a group of 25 dissidents led by Helmuth James von Moltke, who was related to the famous German generals from the past who had the same name. And the group was based in Silesia. It consisted of different men and women from different backgrounds and political affiliations, who managed to set aside their differences because they had a common aversion against Hitler and the Nazi regime. They discussed how to set up a German government once the Third Reich was no more. Early 1944, von Moltke was arrested, and after the failed July plot, I get to that later, many other members were arrested as well. Von Moltke was executed early 1945. The Edelweiss Pirates was a group of youths that emerged in the west of Germany and rejected the norms of Nazi society. Now, further east in Leipzig, there was the Leipzig Meute. That was basically more of a gang of youngsters that opposed the regime and wanted to overthrow it. And then there was a National Committee for Free Germany, a German anti-Nazi organization that was founded by the Soviets in their POW camps after the Battle of Stalingrad. Also communist Germans who had fled to the USSR before Operation Barbarossa started and that weren't purged by Stalin, they also were part of this organization, and some of its members helped to found the future East German communist state. So let's take a look at the army. The army had the biggest chance to overthrow the Nazi regime. Many German generals were no Nazis. They were conservatives. But because of their oath, they felt connected to Hitler and Germany. Now, there was an attempt to assassinate Hitler in 1938, but due to misplaced feelings of loyalty and timidity, this plan was not carried out. Military leaders feared that Hitler would bring down Germany as a whole. And these fears became more and more of a reality when the Germans started to suffer losses on the Eastern Front, first at Moscow, later at Stalingrad, and then at Kursk. New plans to assassinate Hitler came up towards the end of 1942, when the Stalingrad disaster unfolded. And 3 attempts were undertaken in 1943, but they all failed. Oberst Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg had new plans when he was installed at the German replacement army in Berlin. He wanted to subvert an existing plan named Operation Valkyrie. The replacement army was meant to quell a possible uprising by foreign laborers in the Reich, and that would circumvent the involvement of the SS. Now, with this operation, he wanted to seize power in Berlin, but for that, Hitler needed to be dead. One important thing I do have to point out is that these conspirators were no peace-loving Democrats. Many had a conservative background, and many approved of the execution of Operation Barbarossa and its destructive nature. They wanted to retain the war on the Eastern Front. However, they did want to get rid of Hitler, and many of them also advocated against the genocidal policies of the Nazis. Most of these conspirators can be seen as conservative people who wanted to, let's say, restore a more German empire-like state once the Third Reich would find its demise. On the 20th of July, von Stauffenberg joined Hitler's meeting in a pinewood forest near Rastenburg in East Prussia, now Poland. At a certain moment, von Stauffenberg left with his briefcase to prime 2 bombs. Before he had time to finish, he was called back to the conference room. He took the briefcase back to the room. He answered several questions about the replacement army, and after this he shoved the briefcase with just 1 bomb in it under a heavy table where Hitler was standing. At one moment everybody bent over the maps, and that was the moment that von Stauffenberg left. He left the building, entered his car and drove off as the bomb went off. Von Stauffenberg then flew back to Berlin. Operation Valkyrie was set in motion, but uncertainty, confusion and the unexpected complications contributed in his plans. But that was not the biggest problem. The communications between Hitler's bunker and Berlin remained intact. But the biggest problem was Hitler. Hitler was not dead. The bomb had killed a few, injured some more, and Hitler was only lightly wounded. Towards that evening, Goebbels announced on the German radio that their beloved Führer was alive and well. Hitler unleashed a terrible vengeance on the conspirators and those associated with them. Von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirator Albrecht were shot in the courtyard of the War Ministry in Berlin. More than 5,000 Germans were accused in the following months. Some generals committed suicide. General Erwin Rommel was, due to his hero status, given the option of committing suicide with a cyanide pill rather than facing a show trial which would lead to his degradation and execution. Whereas the July plot was meant to save Germany and save German lives, it had the exact opposite effect. Stauffenberg's assassination attempt marked an internal shift in the history of the Third Reich. With the failure of the plot came not only the fearful reprisals against those involved, but also a sharp radicalization of the regime, both in repression and in mobilization. The consequence of that I did cover in an earlier video that I made, which is actually the best watched video on this channel, so check it out if you have not already. See the link in the end card. A different form of military resistance occurred on a much lower level, and then I'm talking about men who refused to fight. They were the conscientious objectors. Many of them had a Jehovah's Witness background. They refused to be drafted in the army. Many of them were executed. I read that already in the first year of the Second World War, over 100 were executed by the Nazi regime. Then there were also deserters, those who left the ranks. The Nazi regime also had no mercy for these men once they were caught. And during the war, over 15,000 were executed by the regime. And many others were put in deadly penal units. Some were even executed after the German surrender. And those who lived received no pension, and they were looked down upon after the war. In the 1980s, efforts were made for the rehabilitation of these men. And I read that only in 2002, the German parliament adopted a law that nullified the wartime sentences. Open protests and uprisings didn't occur that much by Germans within the Third Reich, but there are some. Early 1943 there was a Rosenstrasse protest in Berlin. This was the only mass public demonstration by Germans in the Third Reich against the deportation of Jews by relatives of Jewish men who had been arrested and targeted for deportation. On Goebbels' orders, these men were released, so the protest was successful. In the book The End, written by Ian Kershaw, I found a very interesting story about an armed uprising of Germans, mostly Germans, within the Third Reich. And this uprising occurred towards the end of 1944 in the German city of Cologne. Towards the end of October, Cologne was subjected to another massive Allied air raid, which left huge parts of the city in ruins. Some person called this air raid the city's death blow. After the bombing, 250,000 people remained in the city. However, there was no more gas and electricity, water was running low, and so was food. Many resented the Nazi regime and were war weary, especially since due to the lack of transport, no immediate evacuation could take place. But in the following days, the people started to leave the city in droves. But it was then that an armed uprising occurred, as groups of foreign laborers, communists, youngsters and deserters joined forces and managed to get grenades and machine guns from an army depot. They started to fight against the city police and even killed the head of the local Gestapo. In December, the hostilities reached its climax with a battle that lasted over 12 hours before the resistance fighters were overwhelmed by the Nazi authorities. 200 were arrested. I also read that in November, a dozen members of the anti-Nazi Ehrenfeld group, which also had some members from the Edelweiss pirates I mentioned previously, were hanged in public. I do not know to what extent the members of the Ehrenfeld group were connected to this Cologne uprising I just discussed, but I have many other questions as well, such as how were all these different people, from forced laborers to youngsters to deserters, managed to join together and fight against the authorities? What was their organization like? And perhaps more important, what was their goal? What did they want to achieve? Did they want to overtake the city? Did they want to survive? I have so many questions about this uprising. So therefore I'm directing myself to the viewer. If you have any more information about the so-called Cologne uprising that occurred towards the end of 1944, do share information in the comments. I really would like to learn more about this forgotten event in history. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names right now, and a special thanks to Thomas Zabiega, Damian Wallace, Connor, Philip Jordan, Marcus Kaas, Nick Terranova, Haley, Mark Littlehill, Janet Jojankiewicz, Joanne, Justin Tabell, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, Andrea Martic, Susanna Di Bella, John Beach, Fabrizio, Wayback History, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Luis Pichera and Mike West. This was an overview video and I'm sure I missed out on things. So again, I'm directing myself to you. If you have any additional information, if you want to share your insights, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm really curious what you're gonna post. Perhaps in the future I can dive into the details of the German resistance during World War II, since it's actually a pretty big topic. And if you like to learn about why the Germans fought till the end, it's actually my best watched video on this channel. Click right here. Now, a few years ago, I was in Poland, in a part that previously was East Prussia, on the spot where the assassination attempt on Hitler took place, the July plot. And I covered that in this video. I want to thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you later.